Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, whatever you believe, whomever you love, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll, adult religious education instructor at the Unitarian Church. And today we're going to do part 2 of a comparative religion class on atheism, meaning, and today we're going to focus on morality, meaning, and truth. Let me see if I can get this to control. There we go. I want to remind everyone that we do have a web page, and I apologize for the long URL, but it's sites.google.com, view comparative religion, and that should have links to old lectures, as well as additional readings, that sort of thing. I try to keep it up. It's usually a few classes behind just because I get behind doing that. Also point out this class will be published on YouTube, so if you have to leave early, you can't see them, or you miss one, the whole series are put on YouTube. And at least the most recent ones. There's some old ones that aren't. I'm working on that too now as a new sort of project to put up some of the old ones again. But you're welcome to go there to see some of the things you've missed, if you're interested. So why study atheism as a teacher of comparative religion? So you know that I taught a comparative religion class in college as a graduate student. And so why would you include atheism among a study of religion if atheism is not a religion, presumably, or is, depending on how you define religion? We discussed this last time, but just to in case anyone's jumping in the middle, I want to go over this again because it's an important point, especially since it's a potentially contentious point. From the perspective of comparative religion, atheism is one of the ways people navigate their beliefs about or disbelief in God. And it's also relevant from the sociology, anthropology, demography perspective. In other words, we have surveys, and we want to know things about different groups of people. And one of the questions you can answer on a survey is, what religion are you? And we will often then ask questions about different religious groups based on how they differ, given that they answered a certain religion in the survey. So I'll ask a question about Catholics. I'll say, what are Catholics like? And what are their political ideals and things like that, based on taking all the people who answered Catholic, putting them in a pot, and looking at their statistics. Well, one of the options in these surveys that you can answer is atheist. So I'm going to make no theological argument about whether atheism is or is not a religion. That debate can go on all over the place. It even went all the way to the Supreme Court a while ago. Who decided, by the way, that atheism deserves the First Amendment protections of a religion? Even though it may or may not be a religion, it deserves all the constitutional protections of a religion. So again, that debate is contentious, is frustrating. I'm not interested in it. I just want to be able to ask questions about atheists as a group of people and do the same thing we did with them that we did with all the other religions, which is, what are they like? What do they believe? Do they have organizations? And how do they find meaning and purpose in the world? How do they navigate the concepts of truth, and how do they discover meaning and purpose? And that's what we did with every other religion, and we're just going to do it today with atheism without trying to weigh into the rest of the controversy. So last time, I showed you a bunch of graphs, and they were hard to read from a distance. They're really hard now that I've made them small, but that's not the point. In last time's class, we went through these graphs. I didn't make most of them. A lot of them were made by a beautiful individual named Brian Berg, who does great work online, publishing graphs about religion and politics in America. I highly recommend following him. If you want to find him, I can help you find him, but he posts on X, formerly known as Twitter, all the time. He has a blog that is worth following. And I got a lot of these graphs from Pew and a lot of them from him, but they let us answer questions about what atheists as a group. Now, whenever we do demography like this from surveys, we're talking about averages, right? Because every individual will be different and will buck any of the average trends. But we can answer questions about the average. And on average, we discover that atheists are predominantly male, rich, educated. They're politically liberal. They're also politically activated and engaged, far more than the general society. And they are strongly stigmatized by non-atheists. Non-atheists have a very poor view of atheists relative to almost every other religious group. There's only a few that are worse, like Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientologists are viewed more negatively than atheists, but that's about it. We also learned that they have fewer children, and that has implications for the future. Atheists as a group in America are growing, predominantly through conversion. Conversion is a technical term in this sense, right? Because it's hard to say someone was converted to atheism, but deconverted from theism maybe. But as a group, they have fewer children, and so you would expect Christians to grow relative to the number of atheists. However, there are more people becoming atheists than are going the other direction, moving from atheism to theism. There's more people switching in one direction than the other. That's true in the United States. Globally, however, what we've discovered is that the fraction of people who are religious, especially who are deeply religious, is actually growing globally. That is not true in Europe, it's not true in the US, but it is true globally, and the fastest growing religious group is Islam. So that's what we did last time. We discussed what we could learn about atheists from these sort of surveys. But today what we want to do is talk about meaning, morality, and truth. And I hope that this is important specifically because that was partly why I did comparative religion at a UU church. Like, why would I go to a UU church and teach about comparative religion? And the answer is because we're all about the responsible search for truth and meaning. Okay, well, how do you do that? Well, let's see how Buddhists do it. Let's see how Confucians do it. Let's see how Taoists do it. Let's see how Mormons do it. Let's see how Muslims do it. And let's see how atheists do it. And the idea is that each of them might have things you reject, but it's useful to know why you reject it. They might have things you agree with, which is useful for determining why you agree and what you believe. So as you construct your own sense of purpose and meaning, I hope that learning what other people believe and do helps. It's also very informative, I believe, in terms of understanding the human condition. Right? Every religion has something to say about what it means to be human because they each try to solve the human condition and the problem of the human condition in different ways. So how do they do it? And what can it teach us about what it means to be human, even if we don't agree with the conclusions? Again, my goal today is not going to be to convert you to atheism. If you believe, that's great. If you don't believe, that's great. Whatever you believe, you're welcome here. My goal is to hopefully help us understand this other group of people and how they construct purpose and meaning. The difficulty in doing that is that there are as many ways of doing this, there are more ways of doing this than there are atheists in the world. Each one of them does it differently, and some of them do it 2 or 3 different incompatible ways at the same time. That's okay. And so we are going to struggle because it's very hard to figure out what atheists believe about truth, meaning all that stuff, because they don't agree as a group. So what I've done is first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about why it's hard. And I think that's important because a lot of us, I've seen several atheists, like Richard Dawkins, who likes to stand up and say, well, of course atheists can believe in truth and meaning, and he doesn't, for him, the way to approach the difficulty of constructing those things without God is to ridicule anyone who thinks you need God to construct them. I actually think it's rather hard to do. And so I'm going to talk about the problem from a historical perspective and why it's difficult. Then I'm going to take several exemplars, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Sean Carroll, and I'm going to show you how they do it as examples. Because again, I can't show you how every atheist does it, but I'm going to use their methods of constructing truth and meaning as examples of how some atheists might do this, might go about doing this. So first, the problem. Why is it hard to construct truth and meaning without a belief in God or an afterlife or these things? Well, René Descartes is probably the quintessential philosopher that everyone knows. And he was actually something of an empiricist. But he started it with a position of skepticism, which should be very familiar to atheists and to scientists in general. And he said, what do I know for sure is true? What could I trust implicitly? There's no way that I could be deceived about this thing. And he came up with two axioms. The first is, I think, therefore I am. That's the one everyone knows. And it's actually fairly profound. What he really says is, my own thought processes mean that there is someone here having those thought processes. So I think, I have thoughts, I have feelings, therefore I am. And I can't be deceived. If I stub my toe, it hurts. And that pain is real. Now, whether I have a toe or not, I could doubt, but the pain I feel as a conscious creature is real. So that's the first irrefutable fact. There is this conscious being here that is me. The next is he has an argument for why there's a God. I won't go into it. It's not terribly important from our perspective. But then he says, so I'd have these two concepts, I exist and God exists. well, what about all the other stuff? My senses. Can I be an empiricist? Can I believe what I see? And he says, no, there could be a demon. I can imagine a demon out there, an evil demon who deceives my senses. So everything I experience is actually a lie and not true. It's possible. So how do I become an empiricist? How do I build the rest of truth from empirical observations if I can't trust my own senses? And his answer is, God exists and God wouldn't let the evil demon deceive me, therefore I can trust my senses, therefore empiricism, I'm off to the races, I can be an empiricist. Right? So for René Descartes and for a large part of human history, belief in God was essential even to be an empiricist. And a lot of atheists don't believe in God because of what they would consider empirical evidence or lack of evidence. But how do you even trust your senses? And the modern version of this, by the way, is The Matrix. That's why I have the picture of this Matrix thing here. If you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, it's this other, more modern take on the evil demon. What if everything you see, experience, and know isn't real? What if you're a brain in a vat and your brain has been plugged in to a computer who is sending nervous signals to your brain? How would I know that table that I'm tapping here is really there? Because all it really is, all my experience of it is happening in my brain based on a signal that comes and is sent to my brain, right? So that means the table might not be there. I could be getting the signals for some other reason. So this is the modern take on the René Descartes problem that causes us to question empiricism. There's also a problem of morality, which is potentially even bigger. I love this survey results. Is it necessary to believe in God in order to be moral and have good values? Evangelical Christians, 70% say yes. So if you're an atheist, you can't be a moral person and have good values. At least 70% of evangelicals think so. Catholics, 48%, which is under 50, but still really high. The entire sample is around 41%. And then we get the really bizarre one is atheists. 4% of atheists think you have to believe in God to be a good person. I don't know what those 4% are thinking. I assume they assume that they're not a good person. I don't know. Or maybe they didn't read the question. I'm not entirely sure where the 4% comes from, but it's interesting. Here's the oldest kind of example of this way of thinking that I was able to find, or one of the oldest. Think of these things too in light of the brevity of any punishment you can inflict. Never to last longer than till death. On this ground, Epicurus makes light of all suffering and pain, maintaining that if it is small, that should say, it is contemptible. If it is great, it is not long continued. No doubt about it, we who receive our rewards under the judgment of an all-seeing God and who look forward to eternal punishment from him for sin, we alone make real effort to attain a blameless life. So Tertullian is claiming you have to believe in God or you just might as well go off and rape, pillage, and murder. I don't actually think most people would go off and rape, pillage, and murder if they didn't think God would punish them for it. But this is his approach. It's not without a few people who might. This is, if you've ever watched Murder Among the Mormons, a Netflix series, you should watch this if you haven't. Exceptional series. It's about an individual named Mark Hoffman who was involved in the Mormon collection of documents. So it's something I had some familiarity with that group and with that sort of research and stuff. And he ended up forging a bunch of documents, and then when he was about to be caught, he started sending bombs to people to try to give himself more time to finish one of his forgeries and to deflect evidence from him. He murdered a bunch of people. And this was what he said in several interviews, 2 different interviews. I don't feel anything for them being my victims. My philosophy is that they're dead. They're not suffering. I think life is basically worthless. They could have died just as easily in a car accident. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in an afterlife. They don't know they're dead, so it doesn't matter that I've hurt them. He also said, planning the bomb that killed Kathy Sheets was almost a game. At the time I made the bomb, my thoughts were that it didn't matter if it was Mrs. Sheets or a child or a dog who was killed. This man is a monster. This is what we call sociopathy, right? It's an individual who has no compassion for other people. And for him, he grew up as a Mormon and as a believer, and eventually he lost his faith. And as a believer, he kept the rules specifically because he was afraid of being punished by God. As soon as he lost his faith in God, he became a monster. One of the approaches that I've seen a lot of atheists say whenever they're confronted with this idea that you have to believe in God to be moral is they say, if you feel that way, you must be a sociopath. Well, there are, in fact, sociopaths out there. And we'll come back to this, I think. But the problem, I think, is deeper than that. This is Tertullian's approach, and this is the thing we see with Mark Hoffman, but David Hume points out something far more difficult to deal with philosophically, and that's that there is no ought in is. And that's a confusing sentence, but what he's basically saying is, I can list all the things that are. Empiricism tells me what is, if you can trust your senses. Science tells you what is, but you can never go logically from a series of ought statements, a series of is statements, this is, to this ought to be. There is no ought anywhere in the ises of reality. One other way to say that is, reality is a bunch of moving atoms, and there is no reason a priori to prefer one organization of those atoms than another, except from inside our own minds. And so ought comes from inside us, but it requires an additional premise. You can't build it from is directly. You have to have this additional premise somewhere. Somewhere ought comes into the equation, and it doesn't come from just the reality of what is. So someone who disagrees with you about what ought to be maybe isn't wrong in the same way that someone who thinks the earth is flat is wrong. They have a different preference for how the world ought to be, because there is no ought in is. And what if is all there is? If there's no ought in is and is all there is, well then you end up with something that appears like moral relativism, and you wander off the deep end, and you might as well go do whatever you want and murder your... This is where this comes from. Part of it comes from just kind of ignorance, right? The survey, 70% of people think atheists can't be good. Well, that's just ignorance. But for a few people who've actually bothered to think about it, there is something rather difficult going on here. So again, we're going to first acknowledge the difficulty of the problem, and then we're going to discuss how atheists solve that problem, those who acknowledge the problem. But let me make it clear why that problem really is there, because it may not be clear yet. I'm going to give you a syllogism. For those of you who know philosophy and syllogisms, I apologize, but I would like to eat the last slice of pizza. If I don't move quickly, someone else will eat the last slice of pizza. Those are two is statements. Therefore, I ought to move quickly. It seems like that follows, but it doesn't. It's actually logically wrong. What's wrong about it? Well, it actually has a hidden assumption. I ought to act in such a way as to bring about what I would like. Therefore, I ought to move quickly. Now it follows. But without that additional assumption, it doesn't follow. You need an ought statement in there somewhere to make the next ought statement follow. The ought has to be in the premises somewhere, or you can never reach an ought. And by the way, anyone who claims, there's a lot of very smart people who've claimed to find ought from is. Every one of them are wrong. You don't have to check their math. You know they're wrong, because there is no way to do this. It's impossible. Okay. And by the way, this premise sounds rather straightforward. Of course we ought to act in a way to achieve what you like, but what if someone else wants that last slice of pizza? You notice determining what those ought premises ought to be is actually really hard. That's not trivial. It's not simple. Okay. The final reason it's not simple is, what about other minds? We were sort of getting at that with what if someone else wants that last slice of pizza. If there is no ought and is, but there is an ought maybe from inside the conscious mind of a conscious creature, that's great. But what about other minds? What about aliens who maybe think very differently than us? What about Mark Hoffman, who is a sociopath? Why is his morality worse than ours? How do we criticize his, and from what stance do we criticize his morality? It's very easy to say he's wrong because God says so. But if I can't do that, how else do I do it? And what about the xenomorph from the movie Aliens? You know, its best world is when all the humans are strung up on the wall with little embryos stuck down their throat, about to pop out of their chest. Right? It's a very violent creature. That's why it makes of her such a good horror movie. But why is it wrong and we are right? Obviously, it feels that way, right? It feels like we should be right, but that's from inside our own minds. If morality comes from inside of our minds and the minds of conscious creatures, what do we do about other minds who have fundamentally different views about how the world ought to be? If you believe in God, presumably, it's easy. God tells you, we're right, they're wrong. Of course, did you just construct God in your own image, or is that really what God thinks? There's obviously problems with it. The final one, obviously, is the purpose and meaning. This is just the idea that if the laws of nature are impersonal, without meaning, goals, desires, or purpose, and there is no afterlife, how do we construct meaning and purpose. Obviously, that can be very challenging, and in fact, a lot of people have kind of existential crises when they lose their faith. Speaking of which, I do think it's important to give my own bias, right? I am not an atheist. I'm not a theist. I'm agnostic. I don't know. But I came from the position where I believed in God and knew, and so I felt like I had answers to a lot of these questions. And there can be an existential crisis when you lose that. So as a teacher of comparative religion, I really like to be objective and just tell you what other people believe. In this case, it's hard to do because we're dealing with philosophy in a case where, in some senses, there are right or wrong answers. So I can point at some comment or thought by Sam Harris, and I can say, he's wrong, and I don't normally do that. It's like, how do you say that a Muslim is wrong? But I can say that Sam Harris is wrong if he makes a philosophical error, right? A logical error, an error in logic or science. We're in the realm of science where there is a right answer to some of these things, and when he makes an error, I can point that out. And I have my own views. I also had to find a way to reconstruct my own sense of meaning when I lost my certainty about the existence of God. So to some extent, I'm a neutral party in the is there a God debate. And that's why I'm not interested in debating here whether there is a God or whether the atheists are right or the theists are right. But when it comes to constructing meaning and purpose, I'm not a neutral party, and it's very hard, therefore, for me to present this in an ultimately neutral way. I'm going to try, but there's going to be a few times where I will stray into my own opinion, and forgive me for that. I love what Sean Carroll says about this. He admits the problem. He begins his book, which is one of the reasons I like it, by admitting the depth of the problem, which is something a lot of the other groups, like Richard Dawkins, his approach is, there is no problem. This is dumb. Why do you think there's a problem? Just don't believe in God. It's stupid, and you don't lose anything. Well, of course you still have meaning when you don't believe in God. It's easy. Sean Carroll starts with acknowledging just how tricky this is, and I love that about him. He says, the problem is that we haven't quite admitted to ourselves that this transition from our previous beliefs to the new ones where he believes there is no God has taken place, nor fully appreciated its far-reaching implications. The truth is that the ground has disappeared beneath us, and we're beginning just now to work up the courage to look down. He began that by talking about Wile E. Coyote, how he said, what if gravity works the way kind of our own sense of existential dread works, which is if you don't look, you're okay. So he walks out onto the end of thin air, and then Bugs Bunny points down, and he looks down, and then he falls, right? And his point is, we haven't realized yet that the ground has fallen out from underneath our feet, and one of these days we look down, and suddenly we're struck with this sense of existential dread because the ground we used to have was based in a theistic worldview, which is, for him, gone. So he proposes that there is a solution. You just need a jetpack, right? Because in Wile E. Coyote, at least, when he has a jetpack, he doesn't fall. So we need to get to work building our conceptual jetpacks. And I think that's a beautiful transition because now what I want to do is I've laid out the problem, much like Sean Carroll did, and now I'm going to try to show not the solution, but how certain groups of people solve these problems. And again, there is no one way all atheists do this. They all do it differently. And I'm going to do that, unfortunately, within some of my own biases, and it's hard to escape that. I can't help it, especially in this subject. Right? So how do we come about truth? I've been called a religious Bayesian, which is an argument between two philosophies of probabilistic people because this is what my dissertation was on, and I apologize. But Bayesian reasoning is just a fancy way of figuring out what you should believe, given what you used to believe, and evidence. So it's a way of formalizing empiricism, and it's a mathematical way. And so I can mathematically tell you the optimal thing you should believe in the presence of a certain bit of evidence, given what you started out believing. And there's a formal answer to this problem. We're formalizing it in computers and machine learning, and unfortunately our current AI systems don't use this. They just predict the next word based on what humans say, so they're just as dumb as humans. But in theory, there's an answer to how you discover truth. But it depends on updating beliefs in the presence of evidence, which depends on empiricism. So what do we do with René Descartes' evil demon or the Matrix? How do we know that we're not living in the Matrix? Sean Carroll proposes what he calls a stable planets of belief. Of course, this is a great Of course, he's going to come up with an analogy like this. He's an astrophysicist and a scientist, right, who studies formation of stars and galaxies and this sort of thing. But it's a really good analogy, actually. A stable system has planets that orbit at certain resonances and certain distance such that their orbits are stable, and therefore they last. If you produce certain configurations of planets, they are unstable and they will not last. The orbit will decay, or one planet will be flung off, or because their orbits will create a resonance and you'll throw one planet off or one into the sun or whatever. The orbits move around until they become stable. You end up with a stable planet of belief. So the first thing he does is he says, we might be living in the matrix. There might be an evil demon. Guess what? We need to learn to live with uncertainty. But guess what else? I might as well act as if I'm not living in a matrix, as if I'm not being deceived by an evil demon, because if I stub my toe, it hurts, dang it. And so I ought to act in a way that keeps me from stubbing my toe. I've just pulled an odd out of nowhere, but we'll get to that in a minute. But you see how he does this. He says, if there are certain beliefs, and if you're familiar with the Boltzmann brain, it's this idea that maybe we fluctuated into existence as just a brain floating in the ether, and now we'll fluctuate out of existence. It's possible by the laws of quantum mechanics that you can do this. It's just incredibly unlikely. But in the universe of time, there may actually be more Boltzmann brains than normal people. Okay, great. Under that philosophy, you might be a Boltzmann brain. You might have fluctuated into existence thinking you're listening to a sermon, but you're not, or a class, from comparative religion class by me, but you're not actually, and a second from now you'll evaporate into the ether. Great. It's possible. But guess what? It's not a stable planet of belief. Why not? Well, because all your reasoning for thinking that Boltzmann brains might happen, that comes about through thermodynamics and thermodynamical, statistical thermodynamics, all the arguments come from statistical thermodynamics, which come from empirical reasoning and science, and all your beliefs in empirical reasoning and science come about by observing the world that you assumed is real. And as your reason for believing Boltzmann brains are possible disappears as soon as you think you are a Boltzmann brain. That's not a stable planet of belief. It's not a stable solar system of belief. It will decay, and that belief system will fall apart. And so Sean says he didn't come up with this term, the stable planets of belief. He quotes someone else. I can't remember who he quotes, but I got it from Sean Carroll. I apologize for not quoting the right person. I dug through his book trying to find the right person, and I ran out of time looking for it. But so what he's suggesting here is that empiricism is something we might as well believe. Even though empiricism might be flawed, we might as well trust our senses. And once we trust our senses and then start updating them according to something like Bayes' law, we end up with the process of science, and we can go on about our life. He didn't argue that there is no problem. He simply said we have to learn to be okay with uncertainty, accept the problem, and have a reason to move on with our lives and with the project of empiricism. It's a very, very, I think, useful approach. So what do we do with the even bigger problem of morality? Well, I want to start with addressing questions I thought about as a theist. These are not questions, and again, I apologize. I said I was going to try to be objective, not use my own stuff too much, but I had some questions about God as a source of morality as a theist, and I want to go through them for just a minute. Is what God commands good because God commanded it, or does God command it because it's good? And I admit I'm not the first person to think about this, but this is something I spent a little bit of time thinking about. Certain fundamentalist Christians will argue that God defines morality. It's good because God commanded it. That's what morality is God's commandment. And in that case, we have an objective standard for morality. It's great. We can produce ought from is now. Well, we don't produce ought from is. We produce ought from a command from God by definition, which we ought to therefore do what God commands, because God's command is the definition of morality. Unfortunately, the standard is then arbitrary. What happens if God is commanding bad things, like you should sacrifice Isaac on an altar? That question is not as trivial as it sounds. There are flavors of Christian belief, especially early Gnostic belief, where the creator of the universe was actually an imperfect, flawed being, and the true God is something higher and spiritual. This was because they believed spirit was better than matter. No real God would make matter, so the God that made matter must be flawed. Therefore, a flawed deity created matter, the demiurge. So if this is arbitrary, and we don't actually like the idea that morality is arbitrary, it may have a fixed standard, but we don't like the idea that it's arbitrary. But if we don't like the idea of it's arbitrary, then God commands it because it's good. It doesn't become good because he commanded it. But now it's not arbitrary, but where does it come from? Right? Where does God get off figuring out what's moral, what's right? How did he figure out what was good? Is it somehow objective? Even though, does God, as the creator of the universe, make it objective? No. Again, see Hume, right? There is no ought from is, even for God. So we're still in trouble. So now I can step back from my own questions about this and say, well, what do kind of most atheists do? I pulled this from the Religious Landscape Survey, which was conducted by Pew in 2014 and 2007. And you see both shifts, I believe, in time, but also kind of sampling error in the differences here. But you ask atheists, this is a subset from atheists, and you ask them, where do you get your guidance on right and wrong? And some percent say religion, which is, again, I want to really know what's going through those particular atheists' heads. Possibly that religion is a traditional source of right and wrong, and they still agree with what religion says about what's right and wrong. They just don't believe in God. I'm not sure. But they get philosophy, reason, about a quarter. Common sense. Right? It's obvious what's right and wrong. They have not clearly thought about the problem of other minds. Science. Again, science determines what is, not what ought to be. That's a problem, but they think science can do it, or they don't know. And this isn't really fair because we didn't give them, every answer. We gave them, 4 or 5 options and let them choose between it. So it's not terribly illuminating, but it's at least interesting. But to note that they're spread out, right? There is no answer. They all kind of have different approaches. Sam Harris, one of the 4 horsemen of the so-called atheist apocalypse, Sam Harris wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, and I love the subtitle, How Science Can Determine Human Values. We just decided science can't do that, so let's see what he says. He proposes that there are 2 ways that science can determine morality. The first is that once a goal is defined, science can tell you the best way to reach it. That's true. Like if your goal is to not have, all of our coasts flooded through global warming, science can tell you first that global warming is happening and maybe potentially some ways to mitigate it. It can tell you if you reduce carbon this much, then you should reduce global warming this much. So in that sense, science can help you figure out the way to reach your goal, but it can't tell you that you should have the goal of not having all your coasts flooded, and people did. Although that should be obvious, common sense, right? So what percent of atheists said common sense was the answer? But he proposes something else, a way to get over and around that last little bit of problem. He says, we need some way to take what ought to be, which lives inside the brains of conscious creatures, and pull it out into the what is realm, where science can answer the question. So he's a neuroscientist. So, of course, neuroscience has the answer to the problem. And he says, neuroscience might help us measure objectively human flourishing. I put you in an MRI and I ask the question, are you a happy person? And I put someone else in an MRI and ask, are they a happy person or a flourishing person? If happiness is too shallow a definition for what we really care about at a deep level. So we find out whether people are fulfilled at a deep level based on brain scans. And then we can construct what he calls the moral landscape based on this neuroscience approach. Because neuroscience tells you what is. It's looking at a brain from the outside, right? And so therefore, you can construct a moral landscape where you can say there may be multiple peaks on the landscape, but at least universes where Mark Hoffmans aren't blowing everyone up are better, higher on the landscape than universes where we're all being blown up by Mark Hoffman or eaten by the alien from Aliens, a xenomorph from Aliens. So we get this landscape, we construct it, and then we don't have moral relativism anymore because we can compare one approach to morality with another. It's a very novel approach, actually. I think it's useful. This is interesting and potentially a possible way forward. The only problem is, of course, you can't yet measure human flourishing very well from some sort of a brain scan. So it's a proposal that maybe in the future we can do that. We can do the first now. Science can tell us how to achieve our goals now. But in the future, it may even help us figure out what the best way of life is in a more objective, measurable sense. Of course, he is pulling out from is in a magic statement. And to do that, he had to have what I would call a hidden additional assumption, right? And in this case, that additional assumption is we ought to create societies that create people who have brain scans that tell us that they're fulfilled individuals, however we quantify and define that, right? But that's his hidden assumption. It's not a bad one, but it is an assumption that you could actually challenge in some ways. The easiest would be, what if it only tells you about superficial happiness but doesn't get at true, deep joy? Is there a way to get the brain scan to do that? Obviously, since everything we are is in the brain, maybe it is at some point. But you could obviously challenge it at an intermediate stage where maybe I can measure happiness, but I'm not yet measuring deep joy. Well, in that sense, I'm not sure we should create a society that maximizes our superficial happiness. Right? And that may not be the actual peak of the moral landscape. Anyway, the point is, there are problems with this approach, but it is at least an interesting one. But how does he deal with the problem of other minds? That's an even bigger problem for him, because what if I put Mark Hoffman in that scanner and ask what sort of world makes him fulfilled and joyous, or again, the xenomorph, etc. He approaches this primarily with ridicule. I remember part of his book where he says he went up to a lecturer who was giving a lecture on the philosophy of morality and said, do you really believe that there's no way to tell the difference between a world where babies are being murdered by Hitler and a world where we're all happy and puppies? And she said, yeah. And she was admitting the depth of the problem of pain. And his response was to assume that she had nothing more to offer the question of morality because she must herself be a sociopath and to walk out. Whereas I admit the depth of the problem, but that doesn't mean I want to go murder puppies. It just means that I know that my lack of desire to murder puppies is coming from in here and doesn't have a basis in the actual moving molecules of the air, right? So again, he ridicules the problem itself rather than admitting its depth, and for me that was a problem with his book. Not that he came to the wrong solution. I might come to a very similar solution as him, but I would do so, from a position that admits the difficulty. Let me give you an alternate approach. This one is from Sean Carroll. Again, you'll notice that not only does he have the right last name, the same as mine, I like his book a lot because I keep coming back to him as the person who I think actually provided an answer better than other people. He proposes what he calls constructivism. And he says, the rules of basketball exist. Saying that you can't determine ought from is not the same as saying there is no morality. Like some people have taken that statement and said that means morality doesn't exist. It's all a fiction, all an illusion in our own mind. There's no such thing as right, wrong, good, bad. He says, no. The rules of basketball exist, but they were constructed, not from my own brain, but as a collective endeavor. And this is slightly where he differs a little bit from Sean Carroll, and I think addresses the problem of other minds a little bit better. The rules of basketball were constructed, and you can have reasonable discussions about who has the best rules of basketball, right? Did basketball become a better game when they invented the three-point line? Yeah. Why? More people liked watching it. What do we do with the people who don't like basketball and want to play golf? That's a whole other question, but we can at least say that adding the three-point line to the basketball game made it more exciting, and more people watched it, and it made more money, and so it's better. And how do you define better? Well, we like it more as a social construct, not as an individual construct, but as a society, we construct it. And then he says, admitting that morality is constructed is hard, it is challenging, but it doesn't mean that all hell is broken loose. It doesn't mean that we have to agree that the best game involves Mark Hoffman. We as a society don't like that game, and we're going to put people like that in jail. Gosh darn it. And we're not going to be social relativists. We can go to a society and say, we think this way of living does not lead to human flourishing, and as a social construct, we don't like it, and we don't want to live that way. And I think this is probably the best answer for how to do this. And this is what I think is really interesting with almost all of these solutions, this is true whether you believe in God or not. Because Remember my earlier question? Does God command it because, is it right because God commanded it, or does God command it because it's right? I don't want right to be arbitrary, so I don't like the first one. And the second one? Well, okay, maybe God commanded it because it's already right. Well, if it's already right, where did that come from? And the answer has to have something to do with the minds of conscious creatures who construct a world that they want to live in, a world where people love each other, where they care about each other. That's a better world because most of us think that's a world we would rather live in. And so we construct a set of rules and morality based around how we achieve that goal that we want. And then you can have the moral landscape that Sam Harris wants, right? You can construct all the rest. Another way to look at this is what we want. Well, the last bit of this is, where does what we want come from? And is that real? If all it is moving molecules, where does that come from? And he gives the example of Boyle's law. Boyle's law is a way of relating pressure, volume, and temperature in a gas. And his point is that from the position of statistical thermodynamics, Boyle's law does not exist. It is not in the quantum mechanical equations anywhere. The quantum mechanical equations govern how these molecules move around, and it tells you, what is. But Boyle's law isn't in there anywhere. And yet, it's incredibly useful as a higher level theory. What he calls it is an emergent theory that explains something more fundamental happening without making you know the position of every molecule in the gas. You can just look at its temperature and figure out what its pressure is going to be most of the time. It may vary a little bit as these molecules move around, but you can approximate the pressure. And so at a large scale, this new law emerges from this underlying law. And his argument is our sense of what we like, what we love, emerges through evolution in our brains and through the interactions in our brains until we have an internal position that emerges like Boyle's law emerges and is therefore real. Just because it doesn't show up in the individual molecules doesn't mean it's not real. It means it comes about through an emergent property and from the inside of the brains of a conscious creature. And then again, constructivism also then deals, I already kind of mentioned this, but it deals with the problem of other minds because it's a collective endeavor as we come up with the rules of basketball. What do we do with people who want to play golf? Well, if they want to play golf and they aren't going to hurt us and stop us from playing basketball, maybe we should let them. This is where kind of my general position of tolerance and kind of individual freedom comes from, right? If we all want slightly different things, we should maybe let people play different games. Maybe that maximizes the moral landscape for our society, so long as their playing golf doesn't stop me from playing basketball. And so we can maybe create a world based on constructed rules that are as open and individualized as possible without harming other people. And that creates maybe something of a global optimization where we all can kind of do different pieces of this. What's really interesting to me is that this looks a lot, refer back to my classes in 2019 on Buddhism, this looks a lot like the Buddhist two truths, his idea of the emergent Boyle's law thing. There's relative truth, which is Boyle's law, or our world from inside of our minds, where we prefer some things over others. That's what Buddhists call relative truth. Absolute truth is those moving molecules. The insight of Buddhism is by recognizing absolute truth, we don't give up on our own desires and relative truth. It's just we approach them a little bit more lightly and then we suffer a little bit less. Because we recognize there is a sense in which this is all just moving molecules. Whatever happens will be okay. But it doesn't mean I don't want to save puppies. It just means that I suffer a little less because I have faced the reality of absolute truth. And instead of seeing absolute truth and that recognition of the moving molecules as all there is, as something to be terrified of, existential terror, there's this perspective of release through that recognition, which I think is fascinating. So I think that this approach of Sean Carroll's is fascinating in that it has this similarity to this Buddhist reference that we've talked about before. Let's finally end with this concept of meaning and purpose. So if you can construct morality, if there can be a reason to be an empiricist and then to trust morality, well, then what do we do about meaning and purpose? And again, just like I did with morality, I want to start with my own musings on the subject, a few of them that I had back when I was a theist. And the first was, my master's thesis was on what we call transfer learning. I was trying to figure out how to teach a very simple artificial intelligence to solve one problem and then use what it learned from solving that one problem to solve another problem. And it turns out if you set up AIs in kind of a silly way, which is what we were doing back in the day, it's really hard. And so I wrote a master's thesis on why it's hard and what we could maybe do differently. And so I have, a starting point and a goal, and the AI learns to do this. Learns to do this, but then, there we go, learns to do this, but then I want to transfer and teach it to do this. So what I did when I created this world is I created a world in which there was a God. This is one way to think about what I did, in the sense that the agent living in my world was rather dumb. I get it. Didn't have a lot of, a very rich environment. It could only move up, down, left, right, and all that stuff. But it lived in a world where there was a creator. It lived in a created world. And if you define God as just a creator, then for this being at least, there was a God, period. There was a God. I was this being's God. So one of the questions, one of the kind of epiphanies I had while doing this work was, did I provide this being with meaning, purpose? And I imagined it to be far smarter than it was. I named it Dot. This is my Dot. Right? Actually, Heidi named it Dot. And I asked what I think is a reasonable question. Does living inside that created world give to Dot meaning and purpose? And the answer was no. Dot's purpose was to maximize its utility function that I created for it. We have a utility function in our brains created by God or by evolution, whatever you think. And Dot's goal was to maximize that utility function. In fact, if Dot tried to do something else, it would have messed up my purpose. Because my purpose was to study the mechanics of transfer learning from one task and then transferring it to another. That was my goal, transfer learning. Learn about transfer learning in a meta sense. That was not my agent's goal, and I didn't want it to be my agent's goal. I didn't want my agent to have the same goal as me, as its creator. I wanted it to do something different. And I was happy with it doing something different. And if it had to create meaning and purpose in its life, its meaning and purpose should be vastly different than mine. And my position as a creator could not grant to that being meaning and purpose. It had to come somehow from within that being. Well, that's interesting because I think it provides a mechanism in which meaning and purpose can exist independently of a deity. So, for example, by the way, I also want to point out that this approach to meaning and purpose is not alien to some religious groups. I pulled this example from Mormonism because I grew up Mormon. I apologize for that, but there are other religious groups who came to similar conclusions. This is what Joseph Smith said in the Book of Mormon. Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. In other words, and then Joseph goes on to say, God's work and glory is to bring about the immortality and eternal life and joy, therefore, of man. In other words, God has a purpose to bring about immortality and eternal life so that we can have joy. In other words, God had a plan that is the best way to achieve joy. And the purpose of God's plan was to make conscious beings who had joy. Not happiness, not superficial, but deep and abiding joy. That was the goal and purpose of life, and it was God's goal and purpose, which comes back to this: God commanded it because it's right. It's not right because God commanded it. And what is right? That which leads to joy for us as human beings. It just so happens, and I know a lot of people have, when they lose their faith in God, they have an existential crisis. They feel like there is no sense of meaning or purpose anymore. But it just so happens that if we think deeply about this source of meaning and purpose, it is something that does not and should not go away without God. Because if the purpose was to bring about joy to humanity, and that was sufficient to give me a sense of meaning and purpose as a theist, it should be sufficient to give me a sense of meaning and purpose as an agnostic individual, or you as an atheist, or what have you. So again, my point is, all is not as bad as we think when we remove God from this equation, once we spend some time thinking deeply about where this comes from in the first place. This is how Sean Carroll says it. I want to argue that though we are part of the universe that runs according to impersonal underlying laws, we nonetheless matter. We are collections of atoms operating independently of any immaterial spirits or influences, and we are thinking and feeling people who bring meaning into existence by the way we live our lives. This is his concept of emergence and multiple layers at which we can talk about the universe. At the fundamental level, where there is only impersonal laws moving atoms, and at this higher level, where we are thinking, feeling, conscious creatures who have a sense of meaning and purpose. The world is just the world unfolding according to patterns of nature, free of any judgmental attributes. The world exists. Beauty and goodness are things we bring to it and from inside of us. Carl Sagan said, we are the way for the universe to know itself. Some part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return, and we can because the cosmos is also within us. We are made of star stuff. This approach is what we call, of empiricism and belief outside of this kind of informed, non-informed by God, is what we call naturalism. That can be summed up in three kind of sentences. There's only one world, the natural world. The world evolves according to unbroken patterns, which we call the laws of nature. And the only reliable way of learning about the world is by observing it, empiricism. And this is what Sean Carroll calls poetic naturalism. There are many ways of talking about the world. All good ways of talking must be consistent with one another and with the world, and our purpose in the moment determine the best way of talking. And in that sense, there is a poetic element of naturalism. This is what allows him to say the world exists, and we are thinking, feeling, caring creatures who love and want to be happy and want others to be happy. I gave a sermon on this topic, which I called Poetic Naturalism, where I used Mary Oliver and Sean Carroll and talked about the source of truth and meaning. That was more directed at my own perspective. This has been an attempt to kind of show how atheists in general do it, but of course I gravitated back to a little of my own emphasis on poetic naturalism because I think it's the best approach I've ever seen an atheist or naturalist put forward. So, conclusion. Again, I've always aimed my comparative religion classes at trying to understand how different groups construct morality and meaning from life, and I do that so that we can enrich our own sense of morality and meaning. How those who don't believe in God or the afterlife or higher power go about that seems, to me at least, to be incredibly important. Whether or not we agree with them, whether or not we believe in God, and none of my purpose here has been to show you that you don't need God or that God doesn't exist or whatever. I've been trying to help you see how people who don't believe in God might have a sense of morality, purpose, meaning, and be able to continue about their life in that way. And I also hope, if you, again, I don't try to convince people of theological points usually, but I hope that I could maybe convince you of a little less of the stigmatism, because we just discussed how much in the last class, how deeply stigmatized atheists as a group are. How many theists believe it's not possible to be a good person. If you believe in God and you believe the light of Christ or whatever you're Christian is in every man, then the desire to be a good person is in even people who don't believe. And so from within their own mind, they want to construct a morality that is good and beautiful, just like you do. And so maybe we can sort of remove some of this stigmatism, even among groups we don't agree with. I think that also should maybe go the other direction. I know a lot of atheists who are very antagonistic towards believers, and that was my biggest problem. When I said I surveyed several books, and one of my biggest problems with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris was this sort of smug disdain for anyone who believed. That is not something I felt from Sean Carroll. He spent a lot of time explaining why he doesn't believe and talking about how he just constructs meaning and purpose in the presence of that non-belief, while admitting that it's hard and without ridiculing anyone who believes differently. It was a very big breath of fresh air. So, further reading. These are some of the books I just kind of went through in preparation for this one. The Grand Design is good by Stephen Hawking, but it was short, and I didn't feel like it said very much that I hadn't already kind of thought through, but it's not a bad book. The Moral Landscape proposes very interesting ideas, especially this sort of neuroscience way of pulling out from his. Very interesting book. I think he underplays the problem of other minds, doesn't admit the difficulty, but it's at least interesting. That's Sam Harris. And my favorite here was The Big Picture by Sean Carroll, which I should point out, his whole technique for producing meaning and purpose in life was very much the conclusion I had come to as a believer. And so I think that his approach is something that might be useful for believers, non-believers alike. It's how I construct meaning now. It's how I did it as a believer, and it didn't really change necessarily as my belief changed. And he explains why it works either way in a very useful way. The other one is The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. I read it. I'm glad I read it. He spends 90% of his time trying to convince everyone that they should be an atheist, rather than talking about how to kind of construct moral purpose in life. In fact, he spends a lot of time ridiculing anyone who thinks you need God to do that. It's easy to do without God. Of course it is. And again, I felt like that was condescending and not terribly helpful. He also, a couple times, talks about, teaching people to believe what their parents believed in God is a form of child abuse. And he says, no one ever killed anyone for their lack of belief in God. It's only theists who commit murder. And oh, by the way, teaching children to believe in God is a form of child abuse. And so we need to do something about this. And he seems ignorant of the danger inherent in that sort of intolerance. Because that is actually how we end up killing people in the name of our beliefs, whether God is involved or not. And he doesn't seem even remotely aware of that sort of reality. And again, as someone who believes the solution to our world's problems have something to do with tolerance and getting along with people we disagree with, I found that deeply troubling. So these are the books I read. I was glad I read even The God Delusion. It was very interesting, but I had issues with it. But the other one is Stephen Prothero, God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Rule the World. His last chapter, it's a book on comparative religion. I highly recommend it. You notice I've used it in a lot of my other religion classes. If you've been to my religion classes, I use it all the time. It was very useful, sort of high-level introduction to comparative religion. His last chapter is on atheism. And he spends most of his time belittling the new atheists, which, again, I have a hard time, faulting him too much because I just spent a lot of time doing it myself. But he ends with a really great story about an individual who was an atheist and her children were atheists, and their parents wouldn't let them play with them anymore because they were atheists. And so she gave a talk at a conference about how her children are good children too, even though they don't believe in God. And he told that story, and it was very moving. And he said, I listened to the first half of the conference, a bunch of new atheists like Richard Dawkins, lambast how stupid theists are. And then this woman stood up and gave this talk that was just beautiful about my children are good children too. And then he says, this is a bandwagon a lot of us could jump on board, theists, atheists alike. And I hope we can jump on that bandwagon instead of the new atheist vitriol. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. So God is Not One does have a chapter on atheism that is at least useful. So what are we going to do next? We finished I can't seem to be able to teach both my Bible class and the comparative religion class. It's just too much, so I'm trying to do one or the other. The problem is if every month I jump back and forth, I feel like we lose track of what we're doing too quickly. So I'm probably going to spend several classes on comparative religion, and then we'll go back and do several classes on the Bible, and then we'll go back and do several classes on comparative religion. I'm looking at subjects coming up. There's Confucianism, Taoism, and then Zen Buddhism. We did a whole lecture series on Buddhism, and we never did Zen because Zen is what happens to Buddhism as it moves into China. And to understand that, you need to know the background. And so I knew we needed to go back and do Confucianism and Taoism first before we did Zen Buddhism. And we never did. And so I'd like to do that. I'd like to do Confucianism, Taoism, and then finish our Buddhism series by being able to then circle back to this last element of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. I'd also like to do Islam. Now, I gave a lecture on Islam back in 2015, but that was before I was recording these. And I actually had a comment that I saw, it was posted months ago, but I saw it just yesterday, where one of the people who watched my class online said, "Why don't you have anything on Islam?" And I said, "I don't have anything on Islam. I taught a class on Islam." I went back and looked, and it was before I was putting these things online. I think I need to do it again. I also taught classes on Egypt and Mesopotamia. That was a long time ago, and it was back when I was starting to record these, but the recordings were really bad, and the audio is so bad they're unusable online. So I don't know how many of you are like, "Well, I've seen that. Even though the recording is bad, I don't want to do that." But come talk to me. If you want those again, I would love to get good recordings of those online for my online audience. So I'd like to maybe go back and redo the Egypt stuff, redo the Islam stuff, redo the Mesopotamia stuff, and get good recordings up. So this is what's coming in the future. I'll do a few of these, and then I might circle back to the Bible, and we'll do the book of Joshua, and then maybe Judges and Joshua, and then maybe circle back to this. So thank you all for coming. I hope to see you next time, and I hope that what we've shared today will help you in your life's journey. Thank you. Are there any burning questions or thoughts or comments even before we head home? Go ahead.
So I really like your talk. I really like hearing about Sean Carroll's thinking. And particularly the constructivism aspect. I'm thinking, though, about, say, a society like the South in 1850 or Iran in 1980, where people are being massively oppressed, and the society is okay with it, by and large. So, how does Carroll, the other Carroll, how does he deal with that problem?
Okay, so for those who couldn't hear that, you said that you liked constructivism as an idea, but what do we do about something like the Deep South before the Civil War, or even after, or Iran, or some of these other societies where people are deeply repressed? And how does constructivism deal with that? Because if morality is something we as a society construct, what do we deal with societies where the majority constructs something deeply repressive? I think Sean Carroll's comment is that the responsibility to construct a good moral society that actually leads to flourishing. For him, it's very much like Sam Harris. We want to lead to flourishing. Certain societies construct morality that does not lead to flourishing, just like certain rules of basketball are objectively worse than others, in the sense that they don't lead to what humans actually want at a deep level, to flourish and be happy. They think that's what they want, or they wouldn't construct that, but it's not something that actually leads to happiness. From my perspective, and I don't know how Sean Carroll does that exactly, but from my perspective, it's a combination of what Sam Harris said and what Sean Carroll said. And we construct morality, but there are certain moralities that are better than others. And just like, and Sean does say, just like there are certain rules of basketball that are better than others, we don't have to admit that they're all equally correct. It does mean, though, that if our rules of morality are socially constructed, we might construct bad ones. And then it's our responsibility to, as a society, change those through activism, etc. And so I think from his perspective, activism is important. It's the way we change these poorly constructed moral frameworks. So again, I'm failing to say this well, so let me try to summarize. Moral frameworks are constructed. Some are better than others. We need to work to construct good ones. And then we have some way of measuring which ones are better than others in the same way Sam Harris suggests in this sort of landscape of human flourishing. But it's not easy, right? I think you pointed out exactly why this is so hard. It was easy when we had a God who could just say, this is, No. There was an aspect of belief in God that made this easy. Not in the sense that I believed God commanded it, what it was right because God commanded it, but rather God commanded it because he was right, and he was smarter than me. So he could point at the aspects of my constructed morality and say, that's a bad construct, right? That made it easy. And when I take that away, now it's up to me to figure out what the right construct is. And that's hard because I'm sure I'm going to mess that up. And by the way, I'm sure that future societies will look at us and see us as just as very repressive as well. And we might not be able to see it from inside, just like someone in the Deep South during the time of slavery might not have been able to see the evils from inside their own society as clearly as we see it from outside. So, yeah, here and then here.
Yes, you and I tend to view the world with morality being a human construct. The atoms out there aren't doing it by themselves. And that is a perspective on things. We then take our views of morality and find reasons why they're good to have. But let's take something slightly different in our lives. We deal with what we'll use the word worship for. Now, I'm having trouble figuring out if we decide that worship is strictly a human invention, how do we find any reason for bothering to do it? I can respect things, but why should I want to worship anything?
Okay, so Unitarians are weird. So let's start there. So to those who didn't hear the question, he said, we as Unitarians worship, but we seem to believe that it's a human construct, and yet we do it anyway. Why do we do it if it's just a human construct? I think is a good way to summarize your question.
Morality has some consequences.
Right.
Worship isn't quite the same.
Morality has consequences, whereas so we need to construct that, right? But why do we need to construct worship? And the answer to that question is you don't. And there's a large segment of society who finds no value in that. And that's fine. And that is, I think, for me, what I like about being a Unitarian Universalist so much more than being a Mormon, because as a Mormon, I had to convince people to agree with me and to come to church, because going to my church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, going to that church was the right church. It's the answer for everybody. And I just had to convince them of that, and it would solve all the world's problems if we would all just be Mormon, right? Gosh, dang it. Being a Unitarian Universalist is not the same, because I go to church and I participate in a constructed worship service because I like holding hands and singing Kumbaya and talking about social justice, and because the social element of that, I think, adds power that is missing to my spirituality and my quest for making the world better. If I do it alone, I'm not as effective as when I do it together as a group. And being reminded of what I ought to do by John every so often is actually helpful. It renews my spirit, and I like it. So the answer of why I participate in a constructed form of worship is I like it, but I don't believe that everyone else will. So I deal with a lot of other ex-Mormons, and a lot of them are so traumatized by their religious experience that stepping foot inside another church, even a church so different from the one they grew up with, is harmful. I don't think they need to come to church. I don't think they need to come to my church. I don't need to save their souls. I can tell them there's this thing that I've found purpose and meaning in. I can offer it to them, and if it doesn't help them, don't come. And if it does help you, come. And so I think the answer is there are people who just don't find value in it, and that's okay. They want to play golf. I want to play basketball. And so for me, I like it. And that's it. It's nothing more complicated than just I like it. And other people don't, and that's okay. Go ahead. There's the last one here.
I've been thinking about this for a while.
Oh, sorry.
I have a theory about how possibly ought and is can go together.
Okay.
And I wanted to share a couple of aspects of it with you and see whether it passes any muster. I don't know. So my sense is that we could say good enough mothering that is introjected into the psyche of the child becomes the ground of our morality. Now, not everybody has a great mother. I'm not trying to say that everything is wonderful with mothers. But I do know that much of what our deepest sense of morality is grounded in good enough mothering. And because it is both from the outside in and the inside out, it's, the ought and is are together in that way, rather than one coming from the other. It's like the chicken and the egg.
Okay. All right, so let me see if I can restate that for people online and stuff who couldn't hear. The gist of the comment, I think, was that we as a species are born helpless, and therefore we require mothers or fathers or caring, and therefore we both learn, I think, what caring means as a child being cared for. But also, I think I can go a little further and say evolution designed us to care, in part because our survival depends on us having a sense of caring, loving, wanting to hug, wanting to touch, wanting to be connected in that way. Or we would not survive as a species because we need that to nurture our young. I think that's absolutely true. There's a book by Robert Axelrod called The Evolution of Cooperation. Richard Dawkins has a chapter in The Selfish Gene on the evolution of cooperation, where he points out that there are biological pressures that have pushed us as a species to have some of the moral sensibilities that we do. Jonathan Haidt has made very similar arguments in his book, The Righteous Mind, I recommend, or The Happiness Hypothesis. He talks about those same sort of issues. I think that's true. I mean, I don't think that determines ought from is. It just tells us why our brains have the ought that they do. In that sense, is has influenced our brains, right? But we still would have to say, why should the universe be the way we want it to be? But I can say the way we want it to be developed through evolutionary pressures that are relevant to our species. We want it to be the way it is because we needed that sense of love and care to nurture our young and to survive as a species. So there's good reasons we feel the way we do and we behave the way we do and we want what we want. And so saying there's no ought from is doesn't mean there isn't good evolutionary reasons for our beliefs and desires. You had a question.
I just wondered about the younger generations, the people, in the 30s and younger, and there seems to be a huge number that are not going to any church and don't believe in God. But it doesn't seem to be a thoughtful choice. It seems to be just sort of I'd rather do something else. And
Yep.
I wonder where this is coming from and how it relates to the atheism.
All right, so your question was there's a large number of, and by the way, there's a lot of people who have to go. That's fine. I'm going over because I'm answering questions, but if you have to leave, that's fine. But the question was, there's a large group of young people who are not engaged in church, and a lot of them don't believe in God. But it's not it doesn't seem to be an intentional choice. It's just church doesn't work for me, so they stop going. I think the best book to read to kind of get a handle on that is by Ryan Berg. It's The Rise of the Nuns by Ryan Berg, and he does a lot of kind of statistics on this group of people. And there's certain things we can say about them. They are not atheists. Most of them actually do believe in God. What they don't believe in is church. Although without the influence of church, their beliefs in God and their propensity to do religious things like pray are much lower. But if you ask them if they believe in God, they believe in some sort of vague, higher spiritual something or other, right? They just aren't sure what. And they don't think it matters what. What seems to be the root of that growing trend is distrust of institutions, not a growing disbelief in God, but a distrust of all institutions. Unfortunately, we would, I'm sure some of us would like it if they didn't go to so many evangelical churches, but we would like it if they then trusted science and went to in education and this sort of thing. And that's not what we actually see. We see a group of people who are non-engaged politically, socially. There's another book called Bowling Alone, which gets at this issue. They have their insular group of friends online that they often will interact with online, but they don't have as much interpersonal interactions, and they don't go to church. But they also don't go to the town hall. They don't go to EFY, or not EFY. What's the child service thing? Anyway, they don't. Yeah, and they distrust government, and they distrust education. And to some extent, our institutions have let them down. And so they distrust experts and they distrust institutions, including church, and so they do their own thing. And I would actually argue that's not healthy for society. And not because I want them to have a religious bent or I want them to go to church, but just because I think that distrust in institutions, among other things, is one of the reasons we see things like the desire for such a strong outsider candidate in political views. It's led to changes in the Republican Party that have been detrimental to our society. And I don't think we can heal the country by defeating the Republican Party forever. Eventually, they're going to win. If they don't win this year, we have to heal. We have to have a conservative party that is a viable alternative. And we don't have that because of this kind of glorification of the outsider and the non-expert and has led to Trump, among other things, right? So I don't think this is healthy, and I think it's a movement we're seeing all over the place, not just in religion and not just in less people going to church. We need to, and it's. I don't want to just say that they just need to trust our institutions. I mean, in some extent, our institutions have let them down, and we need to build institutions they can trust again. They've been let down by their churches. They've been let down by their society. They've been let down by their government, and they no longer trust us. They no longer get vaccinated, right? Because they don't trust the scientists. They don't trust, etc. So it's a big problem, and I don't have the solution to it. But I think it's one of the biggest problems we as a society face right now. So, all right. Thank you. Oh, there's more. Go ahead.
One more minute. There's a school of thought that there exists a spiritual world, and in which there's a world that is a high degree of connectivity between us all. And I realize that that's a real leap for a lot of people, for Sean Carroll, for philosophers. But if that's true, then what I do to hurt someone else hurts me. What I do to help someone else helps me. I wouldn't want to stomp on my own toe. And so that then, suggests as a basis of morality, the golden rule, law of love, and so on. So just in my mind, there's one of the fundamental questions is whether that view is true or not.
Okay, so let me see if I can rephrase this. Again, for those who couldn't hear it. I think you made a very good point. There is a brand of spirituality that has less to do with God, but more to do with this idea that there's a spiritual world in which we are all uniquely combined or connected. And therefore, anything I do to hurt you actually hurts me, because there is no real distinction between me and you. This is both a Hindu and a Buddhist sort of approach to this. And therefore, that allows us to construct a certain sense of morality from that. And it has nothing to do with necessarily belief in God, but in this view of a spiritual view. That's true, and I didn't deal with it, and I should have, because I think that's an oversight, because that's a major technique for generating morality for a large chunk of the world. From my perspective, when we were talking about atheism, I was trying to say, well, what happens when people lose that? But I mostly talked about what happens when people lose a more traditional Christian view of God. I should have also addressed that that's one of the things that can be lost if people lose their faith in some of these other beliefs. And so we were talking about ways of constructing morality without that. But I think that's a fine mechanism for constructing a sense of meaning, purpose, and morality. I mean, it's a large chunk of the world does it that way, and I think it actually leads to a very compassionate worldview. It would be a different discussion to talk about whether whether that connection or idea is real, and probably outside of the scope. It would be an interesting conversation though to have, because it's not something I completely reject. Even from a scientific worldview, if I believe that I'm just moving atoms, well, so are you. And so the distinction between me and you is something of an artificial social construct. And I think that's something even an atheist can accept. And if that's true, then your desires are important for me as well. Where this becomes challenging from a sense of morality is, what about the sense of morality and meaning for Mark Hoffman, right? We have this same sort of problem because I'm also one with him, and his wants and desires also matter. And again, this comes back to this whole, well, let's let him do what he wants as long as he's not hurting other people. And if he hurts other people, then we stop him. But this is another very informative path. And one we covered in detail, I think, in the Hinduism lectures and the Buddhism lectures, is one way people construct moral sensitivities. Again, that's why I do this comparative religion, so you can see all these different approaches and find ones that help you in your own approach to meaning and purpose. So I encourage people interested in that approach to look at the Hinduism and the Buddhism lectures that talk about that in more detail. All right, thank you all for coming. Sorry for going so long. We had a bunch of questions at the end. I think it was interesting and useful. And I'll see you all next month.